Thank you so much for coming. I feel like the weather has put up a quite strong competition for the Hackney History Festival. So I actually thought no one was going to come at all, so I'm very, very pleased that you're all here. And I think it's maybe nice that we're a small group because hopefully something you want to think about atmosphere will be useful to ask more questions. So I'll leave a bit of time for questions at the end. While I'm speaking, if there's anything you'd like to hear more about or less about, anything like that, please feel free to say so. I'm Kate, I'm a novelist. I've written 2 novels set in Hackney, but it's this one that I'm here to talk about today. It's called One Girl Began, and it's set in Hackney over 111 years, and it's about the same building, a factory building. It's a fictional building, it's one I invented, and I'll talk a little bit more about that process as I go on. But it opens in 1909. The protagonist is a 15-year-old girl called Ellen, who works in the factory, which is a box and card factory. The second strand is set in the 1980s, where the factory is now abandoned and it's now a squat. There's a woman called Frances, who is a slightly naive, slightly sheltered 18-year-old who finds herself quite unexpectedly living in a squat with a group of activists. And the final section begins in 2019, and the factory building has inevitably been turned into luxury flats, and the protagonist is a woman called Amanda in her late 30s, living in one of the flats, anticipating the birth of her first child. So it's a sort of story about how the city has changed, how Hackney has changed, but it's also about these 3 individual women's lives, and also to some degree how women's lives have changed and the enormous kind of social changes that we've seen in the 20th century. But also it became about what has stayed the same and what things remain, both in the city and in terms of women's kind of preoccupations and struggles. So I'm going to talk about the research I did for the book and the kind of discoveries I made about Hackney through it, and I hope will maybe give you some ideas. I'm assuming it's an audience of keen local historians, so I hope it might give some scope or some ideas for you to make discoveries of your own. And I'm also going to do, if you read into the book, so you can sort of see how I turned facts into fiction, as it were. I'm aware it's the Hackney History Society. I'm keenly aware I'm not a historian. I'm a novelist. My job is to invent things, so in some way that's antithetical to the historian's job. But I hope that I can also, when I talk about the book and I talk about the research process, I hope that I can also in some ways perhaps suggest or quietly make the case for historical fiction and make the case for the things that we can do that I think, and I hope, really sort of value or meaning to historical endeavour, even though we do make assumptions, take leaps of the imagination, invent things, that I feel like there is purpose and sort of deeper meaning to that beyond entertainment. So yeah, I'm going to try and talk for about 30 to 40 minutes. There'll be a little bit of time at the end for questions. If there are no questions, that's taking time. It's not obligatory. So the book, the inspiration from the book actually came from a building that is not in Hackney. It's a building that some of you might be familiar with. It's the Bryant and May Match Factory in Tower Hamlets in Bow, which is notable for being the site of the 1888 Matchwomen's strike. The Matchwomen's strike, again, some of you may know about it, but in case you don't, it was kind of notable for 2 reasons really. One, that it was successful, and they went on strike because the conditions in the factory were so appalling, and they succeeded in not only improving the conditions in the factory, but also arguably influencing other strikes and affecting changes in the law later on. It was also notable because it was led by women and girls, and there's some debate about whether we should talk about women or girls in context of the strike, but for me, girls is quite an apposite term because in the research for the book I did do quite a lot of research and looked through the listings for factories similar to Bryant and May, which employed women. And they really were girls, they were teenagers. It was very common, 15, 14, 13, some girls as young as 12. It was very uncommon in the list of employees to see women out of their teens, really. There were a few, there were sort of a few boys, but yeah, I think girls is an apposite term. So these were very vulnerable, very young women who had a lot to lose, and who took part in this momentous thing. The reason that I had a particular interest in that building was because I lived in it. So the factory building has now been turned into flats. I lived in a very small studio flat there in 2012, and the strike and the history has sort of now, I would say, become a little bit of a selling point for the flats there, because it's sold as a sort of feminist victory, and it's sort of exciting as well at the moment. And honestly, that wasn't really what I felt when I lived there. What I felt was that it was actually a little bit eerie and strange that this was a building in which women suffered. That was why they went on strike. They worked very, very hard, very little money, in very dangerous conditions. There was a lot of illness, a lot of death. And it seemed very strange to me that I was sort of, in a sense, sharing space with these women. I was in the same walls, the same roof, the same physical space, leading my, by comparison, very luxurious 21st century life. And I became very preoccupied by that. And I wanted to find out more about these women, and I wanted to find out what their lives were like. Yeah, I always say that I sort of went looking for difference, and I actually ended up finding more similarities than I expected, I suppose. So that was the original idea. The original idea was that I would write a fictional version of the Matchwoman strike, and fate played a hand, in the sense that a couple of things happened when I was writing it. The first thing that happened was I had a second child, which was not unexpected, but what was unexpected was I thought I'd have finished my novel by the time she was born, which was, in retrospect, laughably naive, but we can gloss over that now. And the second thing that happened 6 months after that was there was a global pandemic. So at that point, with a very small baby, the entire city shut down. The idea of getting from Hackney, which is where I live, to Bow, to even just get another look at this building, let alone go into the archives, was sort of ridiculous. So I decided to kind of make a virtue of the fact that I was confined to the streets near where I lived, and to write about that, and to write about this place which I feel very intimately connected to. I've lived in Clapton for 10 years, but I've lived in and out of Hackney for, say, 20 or 25 years. It's somewhere that I know very well. I've seen change a lot, and I feel very strongly about. So, like lots of kind of moments of creative inspiration, it felt kind of slightly inevitable, and like that I should have thought of it before. But then there was the question of how do I recreate Hackney of the late 19th, early 20th century? What was it like? And as I say, I'm not a historian. I did not have a PhD in social history and working class women's lives or anything like that. I had to sort of, I had the idea for the book, and then I had to sort of find out what I needed to know. So how did I do it? Well, one thing that was very important to me, and some of you may be familiar with this as well, were the poverty maps, Charles Booth's poverty maps. For those that don't know, Charles Booth was a late 19th century, I guess you might call social scientist, who produced exhaustive statistical surveys, maps, interviews on the subject of London's poor. But the maps, I think, are what he's most famous for. He colour-coded the streets. This is a lovely book, by the way, according to the conditions of the people who lived there. So pink, the middle band, is comfortable, red is middle class, yellow is upper class or wealthy. You go into light blue, which I think is poor, dark blue, which is very poor, and black, which is semi-criminal. So you're able to get, at a glance, a sense of what Hackney was like in 89, and I will just show you here. This is when I'm regretting not having PowerPoint, that would be much easier. But here we are. So quite literally, here we are, Sutton House. And I think what's notable about it and what surprised me and might surprise you is how mixed it is, really. There's not any yellow in Hackney that I'm aware of, but there's quite a bit of red. There's quite a bit of red around where we are. These paved streets are pink, so that's lower middle class without servants, I think it was described as, or comfortable working class. And then there is we're getting towards Homerton Station here, so there's some light blue, some dark blue. I don't think there's any black. There's some very dark blue. I don't know if that's intended as black or not. And then I'll just show you. This was interesting to me because it's sort of where I live. But this is Millfields Park. This is Hackney Marshes. You've got the Powerscroft Road. You've got the Chatsworth Road. So it's a nice it's a sort of mix of red and pink and a little bit of blue around here by the River Lee. But what was really, so they're very fun to look at and they're very absorbing, and I think they're very kind of arresting visual documents. What was really interesting to me and was a complete godsend was that 10 years after producing the map, Booth sent people around on walks of local areas to check whether the map was still accurate. So they're called the policeman's notebooks. It's policemen for some reason, I'm not quite sure why, but there were policemen going on walks around Hackney and writing up what they found, usually with a view just to updating the colour code, so they'll make notes like the map has it as pink, but I would say this street is now light blue, or something like that. But you also get a record of what they see, and what he sees when he's walking around. And it's really amazing. I'm just going to read you a couple of little examples, because sometimes pretty much most streets are mentioned. I would say if there's a street that you live in or you're particularly interested, I'm pretty sure you could find there'd be some little description of it. But occasionally you just get these little flourishes of really novelistic detail. So Colenso Road, which some of you might know, it's just off Millfields Road, just behind Clapton Pond, is described as a bare, dull, respectable street, with generally a grown-up daughter sitting with needlework in her lap in the front bow window, just behind or at one side of the usual evergreen plant in an ornamental china pot. And what's also nice is you can sort of start to recognise things. So there's a mention of the Priory Tavern, which is described as being on the corner of Blurton and Elderfield Road. It's described as a large public house that does good business. It's obviously the Elderfield pub, so that's still a fairly accurate description. But then we get to the streets around about what's described as the Fever Hospital, which was Homerton Hospital, where Homerton Hospital is now. And these streets are described as Holmbrooke Street, which I don't think exists anymore, is described as rough and low. Its inhabitants wood choppers, bone gatherers, bottle merchants. Many children were about in the street. Women talking with babies at open doors. Carts tipped up against the pavement. Litter of paper. Some slatternly girls. And this is my favourite bit. This next bit is in quote marks, which suggests, I think, that someone said this to him. No brothels now, but there used to be. And out of quote marks, but it looked as though there still might be. So you can, honestly, I'd say all of these notebooks are digitised on the LSE website. They've done a really excellent job. You can just search for this, you can find the reference to it. And it's really, I'd say it's a very worthwhile way to spend an afternoon. And what was a total gift to me is you really do, as you read it, I think you really do feel like you've spent time walking around Hackney at the turn of the century. It's a really extraordinary gift. So as you might have guessed from what I've said about it, Ellen, my protagonist in the first section, and her family are living in, I guess, what Charles Booth would call a light blue or dark blue street in Hackney. Ellen is working at the factory because her father has died, her mother is widowed, and she's also pregnant. She's about to give birth. So Ellen at 15 is the major breadwinner, and she has two brothers. So the next question was, well, what was it like inside to live in those streets? We know what it was like for a middle-class observer to walk around and we saw, but what was it like to live there? What would Ellen's family have eaten for breakfast? What would they wear? How did they do the washing? How did they make a cup of tea? All these sort of social details which I wanted to know the answer to. And this was a really instructive part of it for me, because this is something that perhaps should be obvious, and perhaps I'm sure people have said before and thought about before, but researching this book really brought it home to me, in the sense that what we think of as history is actually very selective, and it's based on what we think is important to keep and what we think is important to record. So, for example, I could say that at the beginning of the 20th century, electricity became used in most houses. That wouldn't have been the case for Ellen and her family. The advent of the motor car, I don't suppose, made much difference to them. I could go to the V&A, for example. I could look at examples of Edwardian dress. That would probably be nothing to do with what Ellen would have worn to work, for example. And actually, in the course of my research, when I was just starting out, I went to what was then the Museum of Childhood, because I was interested in motherhood, particularly in that time. And they used to have a sort of very beautiful, ornate wooden cot, I think around the time that I was planning to set the book, which I think was used by a sort of minor royal or something, which is lovely and a beautiful object and interesting in one way, but of course tells you absolutely nothing about how babies slept or were looked after in the kind of conditions I'm writing about. So how do I get answers to my questions? Well, the main reason that we know about the lives of women like Ellen and their family were through people like Ruth, through middle class observers. There were a lot of mainly women, middle to upper class women, who came to places like Hackney to do good works and live among the poor, as they would have put it. And but their notes and records are a complete godsend for the novelist, because they made very extensive case studies where you would get household income, for example, how it's spent, meal plans, all these kind of little details which help me kind of recreate that world. And you also, a lot of them also wrote quite extensive letters and memoirs. I mean, I actually ended up feeling quite sympathetic to some of these women, and they formed characters in the book, but there is this like sort of tasteful idea that living in the East End for them was exciting. It was a kind of jaunt, so they wrote very extensive letters colourful letters about the experiences they'd had. But if you you can sort through that, and you can get these kind of wonderful details and this some sense of what life was like here. What you don't get really is the perspective of these women, of the working class women, and it was that I sort of became interested in. I mean, one thing that I really found was lacking was this idea of a voice, and what Ellen and her friends at the factory would have sounded like, how they would have talked. There are these amazing, in the 80s there was sort of vogue for oral history, so there were a lot of records of people looking back on the working class childhood, and they were very, very important to me as well. But a sense of kind of the voices then at that time. It was notable how easy it was to recreate the voices of the middle class women because of these letters and memoirs, as I say. But there was nothing really equivalent for women like Ellen. So that was where I got creative. And that was actually quite a fun bit of the book to write, to imagine these conversations that they would have had, and to imagine the slang they would have used and the things they would have talked about. And I suppose this is where, as I say, I want to kind of gently make the case for historical fiction, because there are so many gaps in our history, there's so many unheard voices, there are so many untold stories, and I think this is a way, perhaps, that we can think about filling them. So, with that in mind, I'm going to read a little bit from the first section. This is a scene where Ellen has just moved into some new lodgings. Her landlady, Miss Povey, has made a surprise appearance with another woman, and they're showing them into the rooms that they live in. Mrs. Atkins from upstairs was sitting on the step outside the front door, which seemed it was never closed, peeling potatoes into the apron on her lap. She stood up to let us pass, holding her apron up to keep the peelings, and we went into the narrow passageway, which curved like a dog's leg around the staircase. I showed them into the parlour. Mother was sitting at the machine and she looked up, startled. "Oh, it's rather charming," Miss Povey's friend said. "Yes, the houses were in good condition when we took them on," Miss Povey said. "Very little repair work needed. One imagines they would have been the homes of a rather different class of person not so long ago." A few genteel touches remained. The dark stone mantel and the decorated tiles, purple curling petals on a pale yellow background surrounding the fireplace. The wallpaper had a delicate print of pink flowers set against cream. Although the paper was starting to peel and the cream was turning brown in patches and at the edges. The hearthstone was cracked, and so were the frilled gas lamps on the wall. Still, I could sometimes imagine how the room would once have looked. I could see a chair by the fire, velvet curtains, a houseplant, a rug. I imagined the kind of people who would have lived here. A clerk or a policeman, his kind wife and serene children. And then the vision would fade, and the room looked like a senseless jumble again. The day we moved in, I spent hours rearranging our belongings, like a maddening puzzle, thinking that if I could just set the sofa like this, or the table like this, I could make the rooms pleasant and proper. But nothing worked, and we still had too many things. A sofa, an armchair, a dining table, a sewing machine, cutlery, work baskets, knives, linens, blankets, and tea tins, all crammed in together. The worst part was that our nicest things, the one we could not bear to sell or pawn, the dark framed oval mirror above the mantel, the fringed oil lamp, the stuffed bird under a glass dome, looked absurd in these dark, overfull rooms. Our finest tablecloth was folded in an orange crate. Our Sunday dresses hung on a hook inside the door. "This family had the 2 downstairs rooms," Miss Povey said to her friend, "and the Atkinses had the upstairs. The scullery and water closet are shared." Her friend nodded and looked down at the papers in her hands. I saw our family name at the top, handwritten in blue ink with the words, "Case notes," below it. "May I introduce you to Miss Morton?" Miss Povey said, gesturing to her friend. "She's just arrived in the East End, a volunteer at the St Edward's settlement. She'll be acting as my superintendent on Digby Street while she's here, collecting your rent, managing repairs, and so on." She turned to Miss Morton and told her a little of our family story. My mother, recently widowed, and her confinement drawing near. 2 young boys in school, a daughter aged 15 out at work, getting by on less than £1 a week. When she spoke, Miss Morton looked at me as if I was a sort of sad exhibit, a dog with lion's feet or a bearded lady. She pitied me, I could tell, but also found me curious, something kept behind a pane of glass. It was almost worse than not being seen at all. So I'm now going to take you quite far forward in time, to 1984, which is the second round of the book. Hackney is obviously very different. There are a lot of empty houses, empty council flats, and a lot of the buildings that we now think of as iconic Hackney, Hackney Empire, Northernfields Lido, Sutton House, where we are now, are empty and derelict. And this emptiness has been filled by squatters, and it was this squatting scene and this side of Hackney that I wanted to write about for the second strand. It's really nice to be speaking here. It's very opposite. I don't know how many of you have seen the squatters' room upstairs, but squatting is a really important part of Sutton House's history. It was arguably the squatters that saved this building from demolition and means that it was able to be bought by the National Trust and that we're all able to be here today. So as a sort of memento of that, the top floor has been decorated as a 1980s squat. And yeah, it's really worth seeing. And actually my research for this strand of the book started here, because very early on I saw the squatters' room and I was very fascinated by it, and I wanted to know kind of, well, where did it come from, what sources were used, the information to find it. So I wrote to Sutton House, and they were very kind in directing me towards a woman called Roxanne Stephen, who was compiling an oral history of squatting. So she was interviewing people who had squatted in Hackney in the 80s and 90s in Hackney and Stoke Newington. And they were great. I listened to kind of hours and hours of these tapes, and I was able to kind of build up a picture of this world, and the things that emerged were that there were different types of squatting seen, different types of squatting, the same way there were very different types of 19th century Hackney. There was obviously a big drugs scene. I remember one interviewee describing, he said he was really into decorating. He took some acid before painting the walls of his squat. I feel like the results would have been worth seeing, but sadly went unrecorded. There was a big activist scene. There were people who were squatting for political reasons, either because they wanted to make a statement about unemployment or about land ownership, but also people who used squatting as a sort of base for activism. There were rooms where you could hold meetings and not having to pay rent, meaning you wouldn't have to work and you'd have time to devote to whatever your cause was. And they were the characters that I wanted to write about in my fictional squat. But the other thing that I wanted, that really stuck out for me and that I wanted to somehow include, was that there were also lots of really ordinary people squatting. There were also a lot of people who just wanted to live cheaply in London and live rent-free in London. And I think a nice phrase that came up in the tapes a lot was a together squat, or a together squat. A together squat was one where people had put a lot of work into really just making it look like an ordinary house. The council, Hackney Council, were quite tolerant of squatters at that time, so it was sometimes possible to get your utilities connected. Some people stayed there for 4 or 5 years, and then these people went on to get mortgages and own property. So it was that kind of, those sort of slices of ordinary life that I found really interesting as well, and tried to incorporate a little bit into my version of it. So there were very different people squatting for very different reasons. A few sort of themes, I suppose, in how they lived emerged. One was a sense of community, which I think now made me feel quite sort of perhaps slightly romantic and nostalgic, that it was quite common to have a group of squats nearby and for people to share things, to share resources. So someone said you would have one house that had hot water, everyone used the hot water there. You would have one house that had a telephone, everyone would use the telephone there. People share skills, they shared possessions. It was to read about now, it felt very romantic in some ways. There was a huge wellspring of creativity, and I guess the thing that kind of struck me about the scene of this world was there being very little money, but lots of space and lots of time. So people would set up a silkscreen press, people would have space to have a drum kit or a sewing machine, they would use it to make things. Again, would share skills or give lessons on how to use things, and that also struck me as a very sort of beautiful idea, I suppose. But going back to the idea of kind of ordinary people and ordinary lives, the other thing that stuck out was that there were people who were making political statements, trying to advance a cause, trying to make art and do all these things. Also, there were people just trying to get by. There was one little detail which I really liked about someone who said he would just buy whatever was on offer at Safeways on Stamford Hill, which I guess is now where the Sainsbury's is. There were lots of council flats that were squatted by Stamford Hill. He said for a long time what was on offer was on marzipan, so he just ate a lot of marzipan and got quite ill. Turns out you can't live on a marzipan, he said. so I like those little details too, that there were people just living in council flats, putting together their together squats, eating marzipan, getting by. That was something else that I tried to incorporate as well. I'm going to do a little reading from the 1984 section, and then I'll talk briefly about the final section. We can have some questions, should there be any. So this is a section When Frances, who as I've mentioned, is a slightly unexpected squatter. She's a young 18-year-old from a middle-class family, as I say, slightly naive, slightly sheltered, and she has somehow found herself in the company of these squatters and activists. We went through the gate and walked over the cobbles through a clear path to the doorway. Jane unlocked a new padlock on the door and we went inside, up a gloomy stairwell. The banister and concrete stairs were coated with dust and grime. When we reached the top floor, we faced a huge window, which I realised, as I got closer to it, was the height of a door. I could see over the backs of the terraced houses, a metal train track strung above them. Jane opened the door on the right, and we were in a huge room separated into different areas with curtains hanging to washing lines. The floorboards were splintered and unpainted. Even with the curtains blocking the windows at the side, it was still the lightest room I'd ever been in. There was a sink in the corner and a kitchen utensil around it. A hostess trolley, veneer with gilt edges, with a kettle and toaster plugged into a cord extension. A few mugs, a bag of sugar and 2 saucepans. There was a wooden table with a rectangular space underneath it where a drawer ought to have been. And it was piled with plates, 2 washing up bowls and a handful of mismatched knives and forks in a terracotta plant pot. 3 cast iron saucepans sat below it. It looks amazing, Naomi said, putting her box in. We made 2 or 3 more trips to the van. Nick and Jane brought 2 sofas with a coffee table in, which formed a living area in the centre. Sorted you out of bed, Nick said, when everything was finally in, and he pulled back the brown and white silk curtain nearest the corner of the room. I saw a mattress on top of a few pallet boxes, slightly skewed. You were next to Naomi and Jane. I put my suitcase down next to my bed. I heard a train go by, and noticed that the curtain dividing my area from Naomi's was actually a quilt, cream with stripes from different bits of material, lilac and purple and blue. I sat down on the mattress. It felt cold, almost damp, and there were light brown patches ringed with a darker brown. I realised then that I had nothing to put on it. Naomi, I said hesitantly, Frankie, do you have a spare blanket or anything? Oh, sorry, love, do you not have anything? Yeah, we must do, let's think. We might have something from the camp, hold on. She went and rooted through the boxes and came back with a thin grey sleeping bag with diagonal red stripes on it. Here you go. Thanks, I said. Nick had suggested I try it out for a couple of nights, but I knew when I left home I wouldn't go back. I packed my suitcase, insisting I would be fine, that I didn't need any help, that I was 18 for goodness sake. My mother had cried and I'd felt guilty and I ended up insisting even more. It felt impossible, after that show of independence, to go home and ask for a duvet. So the final section of the book begins in 2019, and obviously I don't need to tell you what Hackney was like in 2019. You can go outside and wander around, it's not that different. Why did I decide to include that section? Why did I want to write about the present day? Well, the character in the 3rd section is called Amanda. She is from a Hackney family originally. Her mother was brought up in a council estate on Hackney and moved out to Essex when Amanda was small. Amanda has been to Oxford. She has a job as a reporter on a national newspaper. She has broken through significant class and sex barriers to get to where she is, things that are completely unavailable to Ellen. She also has access to 21st technology, 21st century technology, such as a washing machine, the contraceptive pill, to make huge changes to her life. She has a huge amount of freedom and luxury compared to the other women in the book. But what she doesn't have, and I suppose what I felt was had been lost, is the sense of community that the other women have. So she's very isolated in her small flat. She has a baby. It seems untenable for her to carry on living in London and continue to do her job as a journalist. Her partner is at work 12 hours a day. She's completely on her own. So in that void, she meets a woman called Lucy, who's also a new mother, and they form a connection. And then, you may have guessed, it opens in 2019. The next thing that happens in 2020 was a pandemic, and she has to make some sort of tough choices about where she will live and how she will live, that potentially bring the idea of the nuclear family under threat. So if it's all right, I will just to finish, I will read to you a little bit from a man's perspective. I know that, as I say, you all know what Hackney's like now, but maybe there'll be some interest. So again, this is about her entering the factory building, which is the hammer premise of the book, is the same factory building that Ellen works in and Francis squats in. I keyed in the code for the gate outside my building and walked unsteadily across the cobbled yard. As I went through the front door and pressed the button for the lift, I began to feel a familiar kind of discomfort, a distant cousin to claustrophobia or panic. In the lift, in the narrow carpeted corridor, in the stunted hallway entering my flat, I felt that the walls were closing in. Oliver said my centre of gravity was shifting because of the pregnancy, and he was right. I had lost all understanding of how much space I took up, where I began and ended. I bumped into things, I dropped things, I fell over. I'd once read that goldfish secrete hormones in the water to help them understand their environment, and that was what stopped them growing too big for their bowl. But if you changed the water too often, they couldn't read the hormones and they didn't stop growing, and then flapping fins, bulging scales, gasping mouths. It was too grotesque to think about properly. As I shut the door behind me and put my bag down on the counter, my stomach tightened again. The same thing. Rigid, breathless shock, and then over. I took the last of my coffee. Oliver always teased me about how I dragged it out, and I drank it standing opposite the back window. I had once loved this flat. I turned up to the viewing 3 years ago, sleepless, thin and jumpy, knowing it wasn't really what I wanted. I wanted a new build, not a conversion, and although I was looking in East London, I wasn't sure about this part of Hackney. I knew it too well. In the lift on the way up, the estate agent went hard on the history, early 20th century, preserving the industrial aesthetic. He was called Julius, but I don't suppose he'd ever known anyone who worked in a factory, which is why he made it all sound so pleasant. I didn't really like the idea of it, eating granola at a breakfast bar in a room where other women had worked, suffering for very little money. Everyone wanted history, sash windows, fireplaces, cornicing, stained glass, but I didn't. Some things you don't want to be reminded of. But I liked the exposed brickwork, the grand industrial proportions of the double-height ceiling and domed windows. I liked how small it was. It was tiny and impersonal, and that was what I wanted then. The life I'd had with David in our house in Highbury was the kind of life I'd come to London for. Ottolenghi starters, muted paint colours, and organic veg bags. But by the end it seemed oddly dull and stressful, lying in bed worrying about what to do with the celeriac. This flat suggested the kind of person who didn't have time for any of that. Life, real life, the full, rich, interesting kind, was going on somewhere else. So that's the book. There's a little bit of time for questions if anyone would like to ask any. I'm very happy to answer questions about anything, about the book, about Hackney. I'll do my best, or anything about writing in particular. Oh, thank you.
That was really interesting, thank you. I was just wondering, how did you make it, without giving too much away because I want to read the book, how did you make it into a novel rather than just 3 separate stories, or is it really 3 separate stories and the connection is the building?
That's a really interesting question. That was something that I really sort of grappled with in the writing of it. I'd say that I think it was sort of both. So I was interested in I was interested primarily in the three women as individuals, and they're also atypical in lots of ways. That was part of it for me. Ellen is not your typical factory girl. Frances is obviously not your typical squatter. Amanda is, doesn't feel like a typical mother, if anyone does, but they all have their own sort of identity crises, and it was about, I think I felt primarily that it was a story about them as individuals, and there are thematic connections in their story, and there are also sort of more literal connections. And so the question of how, they're connected they were was open as I was writing it. But I think I like to think it hangs together.
Thank you.
Maybe related to that, because in the beginning you mentioned like you were looking for differences, but then you found similarities. I was just curious about like what kind of similarities did you mention?
I suppose the most, it's slightly sort of connected to what you were saying as well. The other thing is that it's not just the, as I said to Hackney Archives, it wasn't just the factory building that connects it. They also, there were also other buildings that come back, so the terraced house that Ellen and her mother live in makes appearances in other ways. There's a cafe, there was once a fish and chip shop, there's a pub. And so there was this sense that as these women are walking through the same streets, they are also doing some of the same things. They are going to cafes, they're going to pubs, having babies, they're doing all these kind of similar activities, just in slightly different ways. So there was this kind of, and one of the things that I did when I was researching, and I would really recommend that you try, is I would kind of walk around the streets and I would look at, look around and try and sort of edit out anything that had happened past, 1909, try and work out what someone would have seen, which bits of architecture would still be there. And it's actually a lot. It really brought home to me how much we're really living with Victorian England, and how much of the spaces we use and the things we use, and the buildings maybe have slightly different functions, but we are sort of living in this world. So that's a kind of literal way. In another way, in terms of women's lives, there are sort of lots and lots of things I could say. I think the most significant thing to me was the question of women's work and how it's valued, and I felt that was something that, for all the advances women have made, have not been cracked. So Ellen's family, obviously living in much worse material conditions than Amanda, but they have the problem that Ellen's mother is having a baby. They have no breadwinner, and the work of keeping a house together in, particularly in poor material conditions in the late 19th century, was huge. Most people had servants, so that work was given to low status, underpaid women. It was sort of ignored. It wasn't valued. The typical the angel of the hearth, I think she was known, the sort of the Victorian mother who is sort of deified, would have had servants to us, but she wouldn't have been the one breastfeeding. She wouldn't have been the one making sure the clothes were clean. So it's all this huge amount of labour that is somehow not accounted for and not written about and not spoken about. And Amanda has the same problem to some degree. There are huge technological innovations, which means that it's much easier to keep your house clean, it's much easier. But the question of who is doing the laundry, who is breastfeeding, who is holding the baby, and how you do that whilst also trying to earn money is a really live one for most women, and it's particularly live for Amanda now living in a very expensive part of the city. So, there's lots of ways I can answer that question. It's a great question, but for me, women's work and how it's valued seem to me something that is a question that we still struggle with today, that women 100 years ago struggled with.
Too true. Was your previous novel a historical novel as well?
No,
Oh.
So it was set in Hackney, it was set in London Fields, and it was, I sort of call it a contemporary ghost story. It's about a family who buy a house and a fixer-upper and slightly sort of strange things start happening, and it's not clear whether this is something caused by the house or caused by the family. So it's sort of different in the sense it's not historical, but I think you could probably guess that I'm interested in the same sorts of ideas about whether a building can hold on to its history and what effect that has on the people in that space. Thank you so much